Legends speak of realms existing far beyond ordinary human perception, hidden dimensions where terrifying creatures roam freely beside mankind. In one such realm, an enormous desert stretches endlessly beneath violent skies, and at its center stands a mysterious tower constantly wrapped in dark clouds and crackling lightning. Cutting across the dunes toward that ominous structure is a massive sand vessel commanded by a seasoned admiral and his crew. Their journey takes a disastrous turn when a colossal beast erupts from beneath the sand. The monster, known as Diablos, charges at the ship with overwhelming force, slamming its gigantic body against the hull in an attempt to topple it into the dunes. The Admiral immediately grabs the controls, struggling desperately to steer the vessel away from destruction. Somehow, the crew narrowly avoids being overturned, but during the chaos, another tragedy unfolds. As Handler loses her footing near the edge of the ship, the hunter rushes to save her. He succeeds in pulling her to safety, but loses his own balance in the process and plummets into the desert below, abandoned in the endless sea of sand. Meanwhile, back on Earth, Captain Natalie Artemis leads a military recovery mission deep in the desert. Accompanying her are Lincoln, Marshall, Dash, Steeler, and Axe, a heavily armed security squad searching for a unit of missing soldiers. The only evidence left behind is a distorted distress signal and a set of tire tracks that abruptly end in the middle of nowhere, as though the convoy simply vanished. Nearby, they discover strange stone markers covered in symbols none of them recognize. Without warning, a massive black storm appears in the distance, racing toward them at unnatural speed. The team scrambles into their vehicles and attempts to outrun it, but as the storm approaches, bolts of lightning strike the mysterious markers, causing the ancient symbols to ignite with a glowing light. The soldiers floor the gas pedals, yet the storm continues gaining on them effortlessly. Within moments, the swirling darkness consumes the convoy entirely, opening what appears to be some kind of dimensional rift beneath them. Their vehicles are violently thrown through the chaos. Cars flip repeatedly through the air, while the soldiers are tossed around helplessly inside. Eventually, the convoy crashes hard into unfamiliar terrain. Dazed but alive, the team crawls out of the wreckage and notices the storm now hovering in the distance above a strange mountainous region filled with structures that shouldn't even exist according to their maps. The environment around them makes even less sense. Endless sand dunes stretch across the landscape, despite the fact that no desert of this size should be anywhere nearby. Even worse, every electronic device they have is completely dead. Radios, navigation systems, compasses, none of them function anymore. With no communication and no reliable equipment, Artemis decides their best chance is to navigate manually using the sun to guide them back toward civilization. Before they leave, Axe spots something disturbing buried partially in the sand. It's the convoy belonging to the missing soldiers they were sent to locate. As the team investigates, they discover horrifying remains scattered around the wreckage. The bodies are burned beyond recognition, charred so severely that even military-grade flamethrowers couldn't have caused that kind of damage. Around the scene are strange patches of melted glass, where the sand itself appears to have liquefied from extreme heat. Empty shell casings litter the ground, proving the soldiers fought desperately before dying. Yet despite all the evidence of violence, there are no footprints or tracks anywhere nearby. Uneasy and increasingly paranoid, the squad quickly returns to their vehicles and drives away, completely unaware that the hunter has been silently observing them from afar through a spyglass. Not long afterward, they come across another impossible sight, the gigantic skeleton of some ancient creature resting in the desert, so massive it dwarfs even the bones of a dinosaur. While the soldiers stop to examine it, an arrow suddenly lands nearby. Instantly, everyone raises their weapons and opens fire toward the distant cliffs. Artemis quickly notices something unusual about the projectile and orders her team to stop shooting. The arrow isn't meant to kill them. Its tip is coated in chalk, functioning as some kind of warning. A second later, the ground beneath them explodes. Diablos bursts from the sand and launches directly at the convoy. The monster tears across the desert with terrifying speed as the soldiers attempt to escape in their vehicles. They unload everything they have at the beast, but bullets do absolutely nothing against its armored hide. The creature closes the distance effortlessly before smashing into one of the vehicles, flipping it violently across the sand and killing Axe instantly. Steeler barely manages to escape the wreckage before Diablos crushes it completely. He leaps into Artemis's jeep with the others, but their survival doesn't last long. The monster attacks again, overturning the second vehicle as well. During the chaos, one of Diablos's enormous horns pierces straight through Steeler. Knowing he's already dead, he uses his final moments to hurl grenades at the creature. The explosions fail to injure the monster, but they create enough distraction for the surviving soldiers to flee toward nearby rock formations. At the same time, the hunter fires a smoke arrow at Diablos, briefly slowing the beast's pursuit. Using the opportunity, Artemis and the others squeeze into a narrow cave entrance too small for the creature to enter. After several moments of frustration, Diablos finally retreats back into the desert. Inside the cave, panic begins spreading through the group. Dash starts losing control, terrified by everything they've witnessed. Artemis immediately steps in, forcing herself to remain calm despite the situation. She reminds the team that they are trained soldiers and that survival depends on discipline. But before anyone can recover, another nightmare appears. A terrifying spider-like monster called Nursula suddenly descends from the darkness and grabs Artemis. The creature stings her, injecting a paralyzing venom into her body before retreating deeper into the cave once the others begin firing at it. Artemis collapses motionless onto the ground, while Marshall and Lincoln desperately attempt CPR. Nothing works. As fear consumes the team, Dash notices movement all around them. More Nursulas are emerging from the shadows now that night has arrived. Believing Artemis has already died inside the cave, Lincoln, Marshall, and Dash abandon the tunnel and continue fighting their way through the rocky terrain. Hunter assists them from high above the cliffs, launching explosive arrows at the pursuing creatures to keep them back. But even he is forced to retreat when one of the deadly Nursulas suddenly begins climbing toward his position. As the group runs for their lives, Dash loses her footing and crashes hard onto the ground. The delay proves disastrous. A Nursula drops from above without warning and snatches Marshall before anyone can react, dragging him screaming into the darkness. Meanwhile, Hunter retreats to a hidden cave system he uses as a shelter. Back inside the monster's nest, Artemis suddenly regains consciousness. Her vision is blurry, and the venom still affects her body, but she can faintly hear the terrified screams of her teammates echoing outside the cave. Before she can even process what's happening, another Nursula discovers her and knocks her unconscious again. When Artemis wakes once more, she finds herself trapped inside a thick cocoon suspended within the creature's nest. Thankfully, the webbing surrounding her is fragile enough to tear apart with sheer force. Struggling free, she realizes the cave is filled with bones, rotting remains, and dozens of hanging cocoons. Nearby are Dash and Marshall, both sealed inside webbed prisons of their own. Still weak and disoriented, Artemis scavenges through Marshall's abandoned gear and finds several useful items: 2 emergency flares, an oxygen canister, and loose ammunition. Using one of the flares as both a weapon and a light source, she cautiously makes her way through narrow tunnels woven entirely from sticky spider silk. Suddenly, Lincoln stumbles out of the darkness, startling her. He looks terrible. One of his arms has gone numb, and he's clutching his chest in agony. Unaware that the monsters are silently tracking them through the tunnels, Artemis supports him as they search desperately for a way out. Then her flare dies. In the brief moment it takes her to ignite the second one, a Nursula emerges directly in front of them. Artemis immediately thrusts the burning flare toward the creature, forcing it to hesitate. But the situation becomes even more horrifying when Lincoln tears open his shirt after feeling intense pain beneath his skin. Embedded inside his wound are dozens of writhing eggs beginning to hatch. Before Artemis can help him, the Nursula lunges forward and drags Lincoln away screaming into the darkness. Seconds later, the creature turns its attention toward her. Thinking quickly, Artemis combines the oxygen canister with the flare, creating a violent burst of fire that engulfs the monster and rapidly spreads through the entire nest. Flames race across the webbed tunnels as Artemis climbs frantically toward the surface. She nearly escapes before another Nursula catches her leg and yanks her backward into the burning cave. Desperate, she throws the bullets she collected directly into the fire. The heat triggers a chain of explosions, blasting the creature away long enough for her to finally escape. By the time Artemis crawls out of the cave, daylight has arrived. The bright morning sun keeps the Nursulas from pursuing her further, trapping them underground. Exhausted and traumatized, she begins feeling imaginary crawling sensations all over her skin, nearly breaking down completely. Realizing her ankle wound could become infected, she cuts open a bullet casing, pours the gunpowder directly onto the injury, then strikes 2 rocks together to ignite it. The blast painfully cauterizes the wound, but at least stops the bleeding. After recovering, Artemis climbs higher into the rocky cliffs to survey the landscape. All she can see in every direction is endless desert. Far in the distance, however, she spots the same unnatural storm that dragged her into this nightmare world. She begins to suspect it may also be the only path back home. Still, there's another mystery she needs to understand first. She tosses a rock into the sand below. Almost instantly, Diablos erupts from beneath the dunes with an enraged roar before disappearing again once it realizes there's no prey nearby. Artemis now understands the monster hunts by sensing vibrations in the sand. Continuing her journey through the wasteland, she notices Hunter shadowing her movements from afar. Eventually, she discovers the remains of a massive shipwreck stranded in the middle of the desert. For a brief moment, she thinks she may have found water supplies, but every barrel and container is filled only with sand. As she explores the wreckage, Hunter suddenly attacks from behind and pins her down. Artemis reacts immediately, and the two launch into a brutal hand-to-hand fight inside the ruined ship. Both are incredibly skilled warriors, constantly countering each other's attacks with precision and speed. Artemis even manages to stab Hunter in the shoulder using his own knife, but despite the injury, he eventually overwhelms her and wins the fight. After binding her wrists, Hunter forces Artemis to march back toward his hidden cave before nightfall, knowing the Nursulas become active after dark. During the journey, Artemis secretly grabs a sharp shard of glass from the ground without him noticing. Inside the cave, Hunter survives using a strange homemade water collection system and feeds on moss growing along the rocks. He refuses to share either with Artemis. Whenever she attempts to speak, he silences her immediately because the Nursulas are scratching and digging just outside the cave walls. Later, Hunter applies a medicinal paste to the stab wound on his chest before kneeling in front of two small figurines he carries everywhere, quietly praying beside them. What he doesn't realize is that Artemis is only pretending to sleep. Hidden behind her back, she's slowly sawing through the ropes around her wrists, using the glass shard she collected earlier. The following morning, Hunter leaves briefly to scout the storm and check the monsters outside. But when he returns, Artemis is gone. Before he can react, she ambushes him from behind, knocks him down, and ties him up instead. She immediately tries drinking from his water device, but Hunter kicks it away before she can use it. Because neither of them understands the other's language, communication quickly turns into frustration. In retaliation, Artemis smashes the small altar containing his figurines. The act enrages Hunter instantly. He lunges at her, and another violent fight breaks out between them. As they struggle and roll across the rocky ground, they accidentally tumble outside the cave entrance. Unable to stop themselves, they slide dangerously across the terrain until Hunter suddenly falls into a deep hole leading directly into the Nursula's nest below. At the very last second, Artemis catches him before he disappears completely. Straining with effort, she pulls him back to safety, then cuts the ropes binding his hands free. Wanting to prove she no longer sees him as an enemy, Artemis reaches into her pocket and offers Hunter a piece of chocolate. Suspicious at first, he cautiously tastes it and instantly lights up with surprise at the flavor. The small gesture finally breaks the tension between them. In return, Hunter hands her his water skin, allowing her to drink before leading her toward the edge of the rocky cliffs overlooking the desert. Although their languages are completely different, they manage to understand each other through gestures and drawings in the sand. Both of them share the same goal, reaching the mysterious storm. Unfortunately, Diablos stands directly in their path. Artemis suggests returning to the military vehicles to recover their firearms and equipment, but Hunter dismisses the idea immediately. To him, guns are worthless against creatures like these. Instead, he takes her to the entrance of the Nursula's underground nest and reveals a different strategy. If they can kill one of the spiders and extract its venom, they may be able to poison Diablos. Artemis quickly understands the logic behind the plan, using one monster against another. The only problem is that someone has to lure the creature out. Reluctantly, she agrees to act as bait. As darkness begins swallowing the desert, Artemis walks alone into the middle of the rocky terrain and loudly sings a military marching song to attract attention. The eerie sound echoes across the canyon, and before long, the trap works. A Nursula emerges from the shadows and charges toward her. Artemis immediately sprints toward the prepared ambush while the monster chases close behind. The creature steps directly onto a hidden rope snare, which jerks it upward and leaves it vulnerable. At that exact moment, Hunter leaps down from above wielding his enormous blade and slices clean through the monster's head. Working quickly before more creatures arrive, they sever the stinger containing the venom and retreat back to the cave. Several Nursulas begin swarming after them, but the pair manages to escape safely inside. Later that night, the atmosphere softens for the first time since they met. During a brief and surprisingly lighthearted moment together, Hunter explains the meaning behind the small figurines he constantly protects. They represent his lost family, people who are no longer alive. The following morning, they prepare carefully for the hunt. Hunter wraps the poisonous stinger material around an arrow tip, while both of them build an elaborate trap around the abandoned shipwreck in the desert. Artemis also begins training with unfamiliar weapons and armor from Hunter's world. One weapon functions like a grappling hook launcher, while the other consists of twin blades capable of igniting into flames when struck together. Though the equipment feels strange to her at first, she adapts quickly. Eventually, everything is ready. To lure Diablos out, they trigger a makeshift catapult that launches a large keg deep into the dunes. The moment it crashes into the sand, the ground erupts as Diablos bursts upward in a furious rage. Keeping their distance, Artemis and Hunter sprint toward the abandoned military vehicles, while the monster tears after them across the desert. But suddenly Diablos disappears beneath the sand, forcing both of them to stop moving immediately. Realizing Artemis needs time to retrieve the weapons, Hunter decides to distract the creature himself. He races across the dunes, drawing the monster's attention away from her. During the chase, however, his pouch slips loose and falls into the sand, the pouch carrying his family figurines. Hunter turns back to recover it. That single mistake gives Diablos the opening it needs. The monster erupts from below and smashes Hunter violently aside. Even so, he reacts instantly and fires the venom-coated arrow directly into the creature's eye. The attack sends Diablos into a frenzy, making it even more aggressive as it charges after him at full speed. At that moment, Artemis intervenes by opening fire with the mounted machine gun attached to one of the military vehicles. The gunfire successfully distracts the monster, although the bullets still fail to pierce its armored hide. Even while weakened by the venom, Diablos remains terrifyingly powerful. The creature crashes into the vehicle and flips it over moments after Artemis dives inside for cover. She barely escapes before it's crushed completely. Diablos continues pursuing her through the wreckage, while Hunter seizes the opportunity to leap onto the monster's back. With all his strength, he drives his giant sword into its skull, but the blade doesn't penetrate deeply enough. Diablos violently thrashes its body, launching Hunter through the air until he slams hard into another vehicle and loses consciousness. Even then, Artemis refuses to give up. Using the grappling launcher, she fires a hook directly into the sword lodged in Diablo's head. As the monster moves, it pulls her upward through the air and onto its back. Landing on top of the raging beast, Artemis grabs the sword and forces it deeper into the creature's skull, finally killing Diablos once and for all. With Hunter unconscious and unable to move, Artemis gathers every useful supply she can salvage from the destroyed vehicles. She even cuts away a piece of Diablo's hardened hide and fashions it into a crude stretcher to drag Hunter across the desert herself. Hours pass beneath the brutal sun until powerful winds begin sweeping through the dunes. Realizing a deadly sandstorm is approaching, Artemis quickly sets up an emergency tent around them and uses military medical equipment to keep Hunter alive as the storm buries them beneath layers of sand. By morning, the storm has finally passed. The tent saved their lives. They crawl free from the newly formed dune and continue traveling together until they eventually discover an oasis hidden among the rocks. Exhausted, the pair finally stops to rest. The area is filled with peaceful tortoise-like creatures called apseros. Hunter explains through gestures that they are harmless herbivores, meaning there's no danger from them. As Artemis kneels beside the water to drink, another creature suddenly bursts from beneath the surface. A Cephalos lunges directly toward her, but Hunter reacts instantly and kills it with a single clean swing of his sword. Later, they roast the creature over a fire for food. For a brief moment, things almost feel calm, but that peace doesn't last. As night falls, flames suddenly erupt across the oasis. Something massive is approaching, far larger and more terrifying than anything they've encountered before. A gigantic wyvern descends from the sky. Rathalos, the enormous fire-breathing monster, unleashes chaos as terrified apseros stampede through the oasis trying to escape. Hunter manages to avoid the herd by slipping toward a cliffside, but Artemis falls directly into the path of the charging creatures. She braces herself, convinced she's about to be crushed. Then suddenly, someone steps in front of her. The Admiral appears wielding a blazing sword, using the flames to scare the apseros away and create a path through the chaos. Artemis quickly gets back to her feet and ignites her dual blades as well, following his lead while fighting through the stampede. Meanwhile, Hunter nearly falls from the edge of a cliff during the confusion, only to be rescued at the last second by Handler, who swings down from above on a rope and pulls him to safety. Eventually, the stampede passes, and silence returns to the burning oasis. Artemis thanks the Admiral for saving her life, expecting another language barrier like before. Instead, he shocks her completely by responding in fluent English. Then, without warning, he punches her unconscious. A short time later, Artemis regains consciousness inside a metal cage aboard the sand ship. Several members of the Admiral's crew stand nearby watching her cautiously, treating her more like a dangerous prisoner than an ally. Hunter is there too, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but before he can say anything, the crew members are ordered away. Once Hunter leaves as well, Artemis starts examining the cage carefully and notices a small hatch built into the floor beneath the bench. Thinking fast, she smashes the lock using the bench itself, crawls through the opening, and quietly sneaks deeper into the ship. Her goal is simple: find a weapon. She slips into the kitchen area and reaches for a knife, but suddenly freezes when a strange cat-like creature appears in front of her. The tiny armored companion, known as the Palico, serves as the crew's cook and immediately blocks her from stealing anything. Before the situation escalates, Hunter arrives with unexpected news. Artemis is no longer a prisoner. He escorts her to meet the Admiral, who personally removes her restraints and apologizes for the misunderstanding. Then he explains why he treated her with such caution in the first place. According to him, Artemis is not the first outsider to arrive from another world. Over the years, other travelers have crossed through the storm as well, and it was from them that he learned to speak English. The source of these crossings is the gigantic structure known as the Sky Tower, located high atop the mountains within the eternal storm. The Admiral reveals that the tower was created by an ancient civilization far more technologically advanced than either of their worlds. Those ancient people discovered a way to travel between dimensions, but eventually their own creations turned against them and destroyed everything they built. Now the civilization is gone, leaving only dangerous remnants behind. The Admiral fears Earth may somehow be connected to that forgotten catastrophe. His crew is heading toward the tower to investigate it further, but there's a major problem standing in their way: Rathalos. The wyvern is too powerful to ignore. So the Admiral offers Artemis a deal: help them kill Rathalos, and in return they will help her find a way back home. Having little choice, Artemis agrees immediately. At sunrise, the entire crew begins the dangerous journey toward the mountain. After an exhausting climb across brutal terrain, they finally reach the Sky Tower itself. The structure rises above rivers of lava, and the group theorizes that the molten energy below powers the tower, allowing it to control the storms and open unstable gateways between worlds. As they cautiously approach the structure, Artemis notices shattered glass scattered across the ground. Hunter immediately understands what it means. Rathalos is nearby. The Admiral quickly reminds everyone that the wyvern becomes vulnerable for a brief moment right before unleashing its fire breath. With that in mind, the hunters spread out and prepare for battle. Suddenly, Rathalos attacks. The massive wyvern swoops down from the sky, bathing parts of the battlefield in flames and killing several crew members instantly. It lands directly between the hunters and the tower, blocking their path completely. The Admiral charges first, his blazing sword cutting through the darkness, while Artemis and Hunter rush in beside him with their own fire-enhanced weapons. Other members of the crew join the assault as well, but Rathalos overwhelms them with brute force and powerful wings. At the same time, the Sky Tower begins activating strange stone markers surrounding the area, identical to the mysterious symbols Artemis had seen back on Earth before the storm appeared. Despite landing several successful attacks, the hunters still fail to seriously injure Rathalos. The creature retaliates by relentlessly chasing Artemis across the cliffs with streams of fire. Eventually, she's forced to leap off the mountain to avoid being burned alive, but instead of falling to her death, she drops directly through a portal. Seconds later, Artemis crashes back into her own world. A military rescue squad quickly arrives and pulls her to safety, explaining they've been searching for her missing team ever since the storm incident. Injured and exhausted, she's loaded onto a transport plane while the rescue team prepares to evacuate the area. Unfortunately, the nightmare follows her home. As the aircraft takes off, the familiar black storm suddenly appears overhead once again. Before anyone can react, Rathalos bursts through the portal and enters Earth's skies. The monster immediately attacks the plane, tearing it apart and sending it crashing back into the desert below. Then the wyvern turns its attention toward the surviving military vehicles. Soldiers unleash endless gunfire at the creature, but the bullets accomplish absolutely nothing. Rathalos slaughters them effortlessly, incinerating entire squads with fire and even devouring some of them alive. Artemis survives the crash and witnesses the massacre firsthand. Realizing conventional weapons are useless, she quickly improvises another strategy. She grabs 2 emergency flares from the wrecked aircraft and charges directly toward Rathalos. Using her grappling launcher, she hooks onto one of the monster's wings and gets pulled dangerously close to it. As she swings upward, she stabs Rathalos with Hunter's knife before the enraged creature prepares to burn her alive. That's exactly the moment she was waiting for. Ignoring the pain, Artemis ignites one of the flares in her own hand, badly burning herself in the process, and throws it directly into Rathalos' open mouth. The flare explodes deep inside the creature's throat, scorching it internally. Even after that, Rathalos still survives. The wyvern rises again, furious and ready to finish Artemis once and for all. But before it can attack, explosive arrows suddenly slam into its body from a distance. Hunter has arrived. He fires another arrow directly into the wound created by the burning flare. This time, the explosion tears through Rathalos from the inside, finally killing the monstrous wyvern once and for all. Moments later, the Admiral and the others emerge from another portal. He explains they crossed over because they could not allow the monsters to invade and destroy Artemis World. But the danger isn't over yet. The Sky Tower has opened another gateway, and an even more terrifying creature called Gore Magala now stands near the tower. Determined to end the cycle permanently, Artemis decides to return to the other world alongside Hunter and the Admiral. Together, they charge toward the new monster, while the Palico chef joins the battle as well. During the chaos, the group manages to force Gore Magala back toward the portal and deeper into the tower's world. High above the battle, however, an unknown cloaked figure silently watches everything unfold from the top of the Sky Tower. The movie wastes absolutely no time throwing you straight into chaos. We open in the middle of a military operation. Captain Natalie Artemis, played by Milla Jovovich, leads an elite ranger squad across a massive desert while searching for a missing team that vanished under mysterious circumstances. At first, it feels like a grounded military survival thriller: tactical formations, armored vehicles, radio communication, trained soldiers moving through hostile terrain. Everything is presented with this serious combat mission energy. But then the film suddenly flips genres. Out of nowhere, a violent electrical sandstorm appears. Not just a normal storm, this thing looks supernatural, like reality itself is tearing open in the middle of the desert. The sky changes, visibility disappears, vehicles lose control, and before the squad even understands what's happening, they've crossed into another world entirely. And that's really the core hook of Monster Hunter. It takes modern military characters and drops them into a brutal fantasy ecosystem where humans are no longer the hunters, they're the prey. The world they enter feels immediately hostile. Massive sand dunes stretch endlessly in every direction, ancient ruins sit buried beneath the landscape, and gigantic creatures move underneath the ground like predators waiting for movement. The movie doesn't slowly ease into the danger either. The moment Artemis and her team arrive, the film starts treating survival like a countdown timer. One by one, the soldiers begin getting wiped out. Some are dragged underground. Others are attacked by enormous spider-like creatures hiding inside caves. Even military weapons barely slow these monsters down, which creates one of the movie's better ideas. Modern warfare suddenly becomes useless against fantasy-level threats. Tanks, guns, missiles, none of it matters when the enemy is a skyscraper-sized creature exploding out of the sand. And honestly, that fish-out-of-water setup is probably the strongest thing the movie has going for it. Because underneath all the CGI and non-stop action, there's actually a very simple fantasy premise driving the entire story. A soldier trained for modern combat is forced to adapt to an ancient world built around monster hunting. That's where Tony Jaa enters the film. His character, simply called the Hunter, feels like the complete opposite of Artemis. He survives using instinct, handcrafted weapons, mobility, traps, and experience. While Artemis relies on military tactics and firepower, Hunter understands the ecosystem itself. He knows how these creatures move, how they attack, and most importantly, how humans survive among them. So the movie slowly shifts from military sci-fi into survival fantasy. At first, Artemis and Hunter can't even communicate properly. There's a language barrier between them, and naturally the film turns that tension into conflict before eventually pushing them toward cooperation. The setup becomes less about saving the world and more about survival, adaptation, and learning the rules of an entirely different reality. And visually, the movie constantly tries to sell that scale. You've got giant underground monsters tearing through sand like sharks through water, towering skeletons scattered across the desert, burning ruins, ancient towers acting like portals between dimensions, massive creatures attacking from the sky. The film wants this world to feel ancient, dangerous, and completely indifferent to human life. Whether the movie fully develops that mythology is another discussion entirely, but as a pure setup, it's easy to understand why the premise grabbed people's attention. Because on paper, it sounds awesome. Modern soldiers trapped inside a monster-filled fantasy world where survival depends on becoming hunters themselves. That's a strong blockbuster concept. The problem is that Monster Hunter spends so much time rushing from one creature attack to another that it rarely slows down long enough to truly explore the world it created. You keep waiting for deeper lore, more mythology, more explanation about the monsters, the civilization, the portals, or the history behind this universe, but the movie mostly uses those ideas as background fuel for the next action sequence. Still, even with all its flaws, the core premise does exactly what a movie called Monster Hunter needs to do. It throws ordinary humans into an impossible world and asks one simple question: how long can they survive before becoming part of the food chain? You can't really talk about Monster Hunter without talking about the man behind it, Paul W.S. Anderson. Because this movie doesn't just feel like one of his films, it feels like the ultimate distillation of everything people either love or absolutely hate about his filmmaking style. The moment Monster Hunter begins, you instantly recognize the formula: loud action, slow-motion shots, massive CGI creatures, explosions every few minutes, characters constantly sprinting through danger while the camera swings wildly around them. It's aggressive, chaotic blockbuster filmmaking that cares more about momentum and spectacle than subtlety or realism. And honestly, Anderson has been making movies like this for decades. From Mortal Kombat to Resident Evil and beyond, his career has basically been built around adapting video games into fast-moving cinematic roller coasters. He understands one thing extremely well: visual stimulation. His movies are designed to keep moving. The second the audience has time to stop and think, another explosion happens, another creature appears, another fight scene starts, another slow-motion hero shot interrupts the pacing. Monster Hunter follows that exact blueprint from beginning to end, and depending on your taste, that's either the movie's biggest strength or its biggest weakness, because Paul W.S. Anderson has always been one of those directors where expectations matter more than almost anything else. If you walk into one of his films expecting layered storytelling, deep emotional complexity, or carefully written dialogue, you're probably going to hate the experience within the first 20 minutes. But if you understand what his movies are trying to be, loud, exaggerated, over-the-top fantasy action spectacles, then Monster Hunter becomes a lot easier to process. This is a filmmaker obsessed with style. Everything in the movie is built around visual impact: the giant monsters bursting out of the sand, the oversized weapons, the dramatic camera sweeps, the glowing storms, the massive desert landscapes. Even the way characters pose during fights feels less like realism and more like a live-action cutscene from a game. At times, it almost feels like Anderson is directing moments instead of scenes. He wants every sequence to look cool first and make sense second. That's why the movie constantly swings between being genuinely entertaining and completely exhausting. Because there are moments where his filmmaking style actually works really well. When Artemis and the Hunter are navigating this hostile desert world, or when enormous monsters suddenly erupt into frame, the movie creates flashes of pure B-movie excitement. You can see why some audiences describe the film as mindless fun, but then the same style starts working against itself. The editing becomes hyperactive. The camera shakes constantly. Action scenes get cut apart so aggressively that sometimes you can barely tell what's happening. Instead of building tension, the movie overwhelms itself trying to look intense every second. And that's probably the biggest criticism Anderson faces as a director. He often mistakes energy for impact. Monster Hunter is always loud, always moving, always trying to create spectacle. But spectacle without emotional investment eventually becomes noise. After the 10th monster attack, the audience starts craving something more grounded: stronger characters, deeper world building, quieter moments, anything that gives the chaos actual weight. What makes this even more interesting is the fact that Anderson clearly loves this material. You can feel genuine enthusiasm in the production design, the creature reveals, the weapons, and the visual recreations of game-inspired elements. This doesn't feel like a director mocking the source material. It feels like somebody passionately trying to turn gaming spectacle into blockbuster cinema. The issue is that his storytelling instincts rarely evolve beyond surface-level excitement. And nowhere is that more obvious than his long-running creative partnership with Milla Jovovich. At this point, the two have practically created their own action fantasy identity together. Monster Hunter feels spiritually connected to Resident Evil in almost every way, from the structure, to the pacing, to the visual language, to the unstoppable superhuman lead character surrounded by collapsing chaos. For some viewers, that familiarity is comforting. For others, it feels repetitive. But regardless of where you stand on the movie itself, Monster Hunter is probably one of the clearest examples of Paul W.S. Anderson's filmmaking philosophy: don't slow down, don't overcomplicate, keep the monsters big, keep the action louder than the dialogue, and never let the audience sit still long enough to question how ridiculous everything actually is. Adapting a video game into a movie has always been one of Hollywood's most dangerous gambles, because fans don't just want a movie with the same title, they want the feeling of the game itself. And that's exactly where Monster Hunter becomes such a fascinating adaptation. The film is based on the massively popular Monster Hunter franchise by Capcom, a series built around massive creature battles, strategic hunting, giant weapons, survival mechanics, and dangerous ecosystems where every monster feels like its own boss fight. The games were never really about deep cinematic storytelling in the traditional sense. They were about immersion, preparation, exploration, learning creature behavior, surviving brutal encounters, hunting monsters that genuinely felt larger than life. And honestly, Monster Hunter, the movie, understands parts of that surprisingly well. You can immediately see the game DNA all over this film. The oversized swords, the absurdly huge creatures, the desert survival environments, the crafting-inspired weaponry, the armor designs. Even the way some monsters are introduced feels like a player entering a new combat zone inside a game. There are moments where the movie genuinely feels like a live-action gameplay sequence, especially once Artemis and the hunter start navigating the desert together. The structure becomes very game-like. Move through dangerous territory, encounter giant creature, survive attack, prepare for next threat, repeat. For fans of the games, those details clearly mattered. The movie constantly tries to recreate the scale and spectacle that made the franchise popular in the first place. Some viewers even considered it one of the more faithful video game adaptations, simply because it embraces the absurd fantasy nature of the source material instead of trying to make everything realistic. And to be fair, that's something a lot of game movies fail to understand. They become embarrassed by their own worlds. Monster Hunter doesn't really have that problem. It fully commits to giant sand monsters, oversized weapons, impossible action, flaming swords, dragon battles, and bizarre fantasy creatures without apologizing for any of it. The problem is that adaptation isn't just about copying visuals, it's about translating the experience. And that's where the movie becomes far more divisive, because while the film captures the appearance of Monster Hunter, many people felt it struggled to capture the soul of it. One of the biggest complaints is the decision to center the story around modern military characters from our world, instead of fully embracing the fantasy universe from the beginning. Rather than dropping audiences directly into the world of hunters, monsters, and ancient civilizations, the movie uses a fish-out-of-water setup where American soldiers get transported into the game world. That approach creates accessibility for general audiences, but it also distances the movie from the identity fans were expecting. Instead of feeling like a pure Monster Hunter adventure, parts of the film start feeling like a military sci-fi crossover, accidentally colliding with a fantasy game universe. And that split becomes noticeable throughout the movie. There are scenes where the adaptation feels genuinely inspired, especially during the monster encounters themselves. The creatures are huge, aggressive, and treated almost like natural disasters. The film understands that these monsters shouldn't just feel like enemies, they should feel like forces of nature. But then the movie keeps rushing past opportunities to actually build the world around them. The lore remains thin. The mythology barely gets explored. The hunters themselves don't receive enough depth. Entire civilizations, cultures, and histories are hinted at but never fully developed. You keep waiting for the film to slow down and truly immerse itself in this universe, but it rarely does. Instead, the adaptation focuses almost entirely on spectacle. Fight scene, monster attack, escape sequence, another monster. Another battle, another explosion. It captures the action loop of a video game without always capturing the atmosphere or depth that makes players emotionally invested in the world itself. And yet, despite all those criticisms, there's something oddly refreshing about how unapologetically video game this movie feels. It doesn't try to become grounded prestige cinema. It doesn't pretend to be realistic. It embraces giant monsters, exaggerated weapons, fantasy survival mechanics, and boss fight energy with complete sincerity. That commitment alone probably explains why reactions to the film are so divided. If you wanted a carefully written fantasy epic with deep lore and layered storytelling, Monster Hunter probably felt shallow and disappointing. But if you wanted to watch massive monsters destroy everything while armored hunters swing oversized weapons across giant desert battlefields, the movie absolutely delivers that experience. In many ways, Monster Hunter feels less like a traditional film adaptation and more like a playable action game translated directly into live-action chaos. One of the most frustrating, and at the same time most fascinating, things about Monster Hunter is its world building. Because the movie constantly gives you glimpses of a much bigger universe, but almost never stops long enough to fully explore it. And honestly, that's what makes the film feel simultaneously intriguing and hollow at the same time. The moment Artemis and her squad enter this parallel world, the environment immediately creates questions. Giant sand oceans, ancient ruins buried beneath the desert, mysterious towers connecting dimensions, massive skeletons scattered across the landscape like forgotten monuments to creatures too enormous to comprehend. This world clearly has history. It feels ancient, dangerous, lived in. You get the sense that civilizations existed here long before the events of the movie. Entire ecosystems have evolved around these monsters. Survival itself feels like a culture. Hunters don't just fight creatures, they've adapted their entire way of life around them. And visually, the film actually sells that idea pretty well. The armor looks handcrafted from monster remains. Weapons feel oversized and brutal because they're designed for enemies that are practically walking natural disasters. Even the environment itself feels hostile, like nature has evolved specifically to kill anything weak enough to enter it. That's the kind of setup that could have created incredible fantasy lore, but the movie barely scratches the surface, and that becomes one of its biggest missed opportunities. We never really learn enough about how this world functions. The film introduces giant monsters, portal structures, ancient civilizations, hunter communities, mysterious energy storms, and alternate dimensions, but it explains almost none of it in meaningful detail. The lore mostly exists as background decoration. You see fragments of a larger mythology, but the movie keeps sprinting past them toward the next action sequence before anything gains real depth. Take the monsters themselves. The creatures look powerful, ancient, and terrifying. Some emerge from beneath the sand like predators evolved specifically for desert warfare. Others hide inside caves like nightmare insects waiting to trap prey. Later, the world expands even further with dragons and larger fantasy beasts that suggest this ecosystem is enormous. But where did these creatures come from? How long have humans been fighting them? How do hunters survive in a world where entire armies get wiped out within minutes? What exactly are the towers and portals connecting dimensions? The movie barely answers any of it. And that lack of exposition creates this strange contradiction where the world feels visually massive but narratively empty. You can feel the potential for deeper mythology constantly sitting in the background. That's probably why some viewers ended up more interested in the world itself than the actual characters, because the setting keeps teasing something bigger. There are moments where the movie almost becomes immersive enough to pull you in completely. Especially once Artemis teams up with the hunter, you start seeing hints of how survival works in this universe. Hunters use crafted weapons instead of modern technology. They understand creature behavior. They navigate the terrain carefully. They fight with strategy rather than brute force. Those details are genuinely interesting. The problem is that the movie rarely develops them beyond surface level. Instead of exploring the culture of hunters, the history of the world, or the rules governing these monsters, the story mostly treats the setting as a giant battlefield. And honestly, that approach hurts the movie more than anything else. Because the world of Monster Hunter clearly had the potential to become the film's strongest character. You can imagine an entirely different version of this movie, one that slows down, explores ancient civilizations, studies monster ecosystems, builds mythology around the portals, and fully immerses audiences into the hunter culture. Instead, the film chooses momentum over exploration. Even the portal concept, arguably one of the movie's biggest ideas, feels underdeveloped. The storm that transports Artemis into this universe is visually impressive, but the movie never fully explains why these worlds are connected, who built the structures, or what purpose they actually serve. The lore exists in fragments, and maybe that's why reactions to the world building are so mixed. Some viewers enjoyed the mystery. They appreciated that the movie throws you directly into an unfamiliar world without over-explaining everything. It creates a sense of chaos and unpredictability that fits the survival atmosphere. But for others, it feels incomplete. Not mysterious, incomplete. Because there's a difference between leaving questions unanswered intentionally and simply not developing the mythology enough for audiences to emotionally invest in it. Still, despite all those flaws, the world itself remains one of the movie's strongest assets. Not because of what the film fully explains, but because of what it hints at. You keep feeling like there's a much better fantasy epic hidden somewhere inside this universe, one filled with ancient lore, terrifying ecosystems, legendary hunters, and civilizations shaped entirely by survival against monsters. Monster Hunter never fully becomes that movie, but every once in a while, you can see the shadow of it buried beneath the sand. If there's one thing almost everybody agrees on about Monster Hunter, it's that the movie absolutely wants to overwhelm you visually. From the very first creature reveal, the film operates like a non-stop CGI showcase, designed to throw giant monsters directly into your face every few minutes. And honestly, whether you love or hate the movie overall, the visual effects and creature design are carrying a huge portion of the experience, because without the monsters, there is no movie. And thankfully, when Monster Hunter focuses purely on spectacle, it occasionally becomes exactly what fans hoped it would be. The creatures themselves are easily the strongest visual element in the entire film. These aren't just oversized animals running around random landscapes. The movie tries to make them feel ancient, destructive, and powerful enough to completely dominate the environment around them. Every major monster encounter is built around scale. You're not watching humans fight enemies. You're watching humans survive natural disasters with teeth. The desert creature Diablos especially becomes the centerpiece of that idea. The way it moves beneath the sand like a shark hunting prey instantly gives the monster weight and danger. Entire military vehicles get ripped apart like paper. Soldiers disappear underground before they even understand what's attacking them. The film constantly emphasizes how tiny humans are compared to these things, and visually, some of those sequences genuinely look impressive. There's a real effort to make the monsters feel textured and physical, rather than completely weightless CGI creations. Their skin, movement, and scale often create the illusion that these creatures actually belong inside the environment. At its best, Monster Hunter almost feels like a giant creature feature throwback, updated with modern visual effects technology. But the keyword there is at its best, because the CGI quality becomes wildly inconsistent throughout the film. Some scenes look fantastic, others suddenly look artificial in a way that completely breaks immersion. There are moments where the creatures feel terrifyingly real, and then moments where they resemble hyper-detailed video game cutscenes pasted directly into live-action footage. And honestly, that inconsistency becomes impossible to ignore after a while. Part of the problem is visibility. The more the movie shows the monsters clearly in broad daylight during non-stop action scenes, the harder it becomes for the illusion to fully hold together. That's always been one of the biggest risks with heavy CGI filmmaking. The longer the audience stares at a digital creature, the more likely they are to notice the artificiality underneath. Sometimes Monster Hunter handles this well using speed, dust, darkness, or environmental chaos to help sell the realism. Other times the creatures look so clean and hyper-detailed that they almost feel disconnected from the world around them. But even when the effects don't fully work, the design work itself deserves credit. The monsters look creative. They feel inspired by gaming logic in the best way possible. Oversized claws, armored bodies, impossible scale, exaggerated attacks, giant wings, explosive firepower. The movie completely embraces fantasy creature design without trying to tone it down for realism. And that commitment matters, because the creatures don't feel generic. Every major monster has its own identity, movement style, and threat level. Some attack from underground, others swarm like insects, others dominate the sky like dragons. The ecosystem feels varied enough that you understand why hunters would need specialized weapons and survival tactics just to exist in this world. Even the environments help sell the creature design. The massive desert landscapes, cave systems, ruined structures, and burning battlefields all exist to amplify the monster's presence. The world is designed around scale: giant bones, giant towers, giant creatures, giant weapons. Everything feels oversized because the monsters themselves demand it. And honestly, the production design team probably deserves more credit than the screenplay. The armor, weapons, props, and handcrafted hunter equipment actually help make this universe visually memorable. You can see traces of the video game influence everywhere. Oversized swords, mechanical crossbows, monster-crafted gear. It all adds personality to the world even when the story itself struggles to do the same. The practical elements also help more than people realize. Even though the movie relies heavily on CGI, the use of real desert locations, physical props, stunt work, dust effects, and actual environments prevents the film from feeling completely artificial. There's still enough real-world texture underneath the digital spectacle to ground certain sequences. And then there's the sound design. The monsters don't just look huge, they sound huge. Every roar, explosion, underground movement, and creature attack is amplified to make these encounters feel massive on a theatrical level. Combined with Paul Haslinger's aggressive score, the movie constantly tries to create sensory overload. Sometimes it works brilliantly, sometimes it becomes exhausting, but it never feels small. That's probably the best way to describe Monster Hunter visually. It's messy, inconsistent, overloaded with CGI, occasionally artificial, but never small. The movie understands that giant monster cinema lives or dies based on spectacle, and even when the storytelling collapses underneath it, the creature design and visual ambition keep dragging the film forward through pure scale alone. Monster Hunter doesn't just use action as part of the movie. The action is the movie. Almost everything, the pacing, the structure, the tension, even the storytelling, revolves around combat. The film barely pauses for exposition before throwing its characters directly into another survival sequence, another monster attack, or another large-scale battle. And honestly, whether the movie works for you or completely falls apart usually depends on one question. Do the action sequences actually entertain you? Because if they don't, there's not much else holding the film together. From the very beginning, Monster Hunter operates like a non-stop survival gauntlet. Artemis and her team enter the desert, get hit by the dimensional storm, and almost immediately become targets. The movie quickly establishes that this world isn't built for humans to win fights through traditional means. Modern military tactics fail almost instantly. Bullets barely matter. Armored vehicles get destroyed in seconds. Entire squads disappear before they even understand what they're fighting. And that's actually one of the movie's smarter combat ideas, the complete collapse of modern warfare against fantasy-level creatures. Watching trained soldiers realize their weapons mean almost nothing creates genuine tension early on. Especially during the Diablos attack. That sequence is probably one of the strongest examples of the movie understanding scale in combat. The monster doesn't just attack people, it erupts from beneath the sand like a moving earthquake. Vehicles flip through the air, soldiers scatter in panic. The ground itself becomes dangerous. It feels chaotic in the right way, at least initially, because Monster Hunter constantly walks a very thin line between exciting chaos and visual overload. Once Artemis teams up with the Hunter, the action style changes completely. The movie shifts away from military survival and starts leaning fully into fantasy combat. Oversized weapons appear. Acrobatics become more exaggerated. The fights become faster, louder, and much more game-inspired. And that's where Tony Jaa becomes incredibly important to the movie, because physically, he brings a completely different energy to the action scenes. His movements feel controlled, agile, and precise in contrast to Artemis' more aggressive military style. The Hunter fights like someone who has spent his entire life surviving creatures far stronger than humans. He uses momentum, movement, traps, and timing instead of brute force. That contrast creates some of the movie's most entertaining combat moments, especially once the two characters stop fighting each other and start working together. And yes, the inevitable fight before friendship sequence between Artemis and the Hunter goes on way too long. But underneath the repetition, you can still see the movie trying to build chemistry through physical conflict rather than dialogue. The problem is that the film often sabotages its own choreography through editing. This becomes one of the biggest complaints across almost every reaction to the movie. The cuts are relentless. Action scenes are edited so aggressively that sometimes individual movements barely last a second before the camera jumps somewhere else. Instead of allowing fights to breathe, the movie keeps slicing everything apart with shaky cam, rapid angles, and hyperactive pacing. And honestly, it's frustrating because you can tell there are moments where the choreography itself could have been genuinely impressive, especially with Tony Jaa involved. He's a performer known for physical precision and martial arts control, but Monster Hunter rarely lets the audience fully appreciate his movement because the editing constantly interrupts the flow. Some sequences feel less like fights and more like visual noise stitched together at maximum speed. There are moments where you almost lose track of who's attacking what, and when a monster movie depends this heavily on action, clarity becomes incredibly important. Still, even with all the chaos, there's something undeniably entertaining about how committed the movie is to spectacle. Every fight feels massive. The creatures smash through environments like living disasters. Fire erupts everywhere. Giant weapons crash into monsters. Explosions shake entire landscapes. The movie constantly tries to escalate scale, almost like a video game increasing difficulty with every new encounter. And honestly, sometimes it works purely through energy alone. The cave sequences with the spider creatures create actual horror tension. The desert fights feel enormous. The dragon battles near the finale line fully into fantasy blockbuster insanity. Even when the movie becomes ridiculous, it commits so hard to the chaos that you either surrender to it or completely reject it. There's almost no middle ground. That's why people describe Monster Hunter as turn-your-brain-off entertainment, because the film doesn't really want you analyzing tactics, realism, or logic during these scenes. It wants you reacting emotionally to movement, scale, noise, and adrenaline. Big creature appears, heroes run, massive battle begins, repeat, and to be fair, that formula does create momentum. The movie rarely feels slow because something is always attacking somebody. The downside is repetition. After enough monster encounters, the action starts blending together. The film keeps escalating visually, but emotionally the impact weakens because the characters themselves remain underdeveloped. Without strong emotional stakes attached to the combat, the spectacle eventually risks becoming exhausting instead of thrilling. But even then, Monster Hunter never loses commitment to action. That's the one thing you can never accuse this movie of lacking. It may be messy, it may be over-edited, it may sacrifice clarity for chaos, but Paul W.S. Anderson absolutely understands how to make combat feel loud, aggressive, oversized, and relentlessly cinematic. And for audiences looking for giant monsters, oversized weapons, non-stop battles, and pure blockbuster chaos, that's exactly what this movie delivers. One of the strangest things about Monster Hunter is that technically, the movie is both impressive and frustrating at the exact same time. Because underneath all the chaos, there's clearly a massive production effort here. Huge locations, elaborate creature effects, expensive action sequences, giant practical sets, sweeping fantasy environments. You can see the budget on screen almost constantly, but the way the film is edited and shot often works directly against those strengths. And honestly, that becomes one of the movie's biggest self-inflicted problems. Visually, Monster Hunter wants to feel enormous. The cinematography constantly emphasizes scale, endless deserts, towering monsters, giant ruins buried beneath sand, burning skies, massive weapons silhouetted against storms. Paul W.S. Anderson shoots the world like a fantasy apocalypse. Every environment is designed to look hostile and oversized. And when the camera slows down long enough to actually observe the world, some of the imagery genuinely looks fantastic. There are moments where the film almost feels like a high-budget sci-fi painting brought to life. Sand dunes stretching forever beneath electric storms, giant creatures emerging from beneath the ground, ancient towers standing alone in the middle of nowhere like forgotten monuments from another civilization. The locations themselves do a huge amount of heavy lifting. A lot of the movie was filmed in real desert environments, and that physical texture matters more than people realize. Even with all the CGI layered on top, the landscapes still feel tangible. Dust moves naturally. Heat hangs in the air. The terrain looks harsh enough to survive inside this fantasy world. And then there's the sound design. Honestly, the audio work might be one of the strongest technical aspects of the entire movie. Every monster movement feels heavy. Every roar shakes the environment. The underground creatures rumble like earthquakes. Weapons crash with exaggerated force. The film constantly uses sound to make these battles feel bigger than life. Combined with Paul Haslinger's score, Monster Hunter almost becomes sensory overload. The music leans fully into aggressive blockbuster energy, dramatic percussion, heavy electronic elements, giant fantasy themes. It's loud, intense, and unapologetically theatrical. Even people who disliked the movie often admitted the soundtrack added energy to sequences that otherwise might have fallen flat. But then, we get to the editing. And this is where the movie becomes deeply divisive. Because Monster Hunter is edited like it's terrified, the audience might get bored if a shot lasts longer than 2 seconds. Action scenes are constantly interrupted by rapid cuts, shaky camera movement, sudden zooms, spinning drone shots, and hyperactive transitions. Instead of allowing sequences to build naturally, the movie attacks the viewer visually from every direction at once. Sometimes it genuinely becomes difficult to track what's happening. Who hit who? Where is the monster? Which direction are characters moving? What exactly exploded? The film often sacrifices clarity in exchange for intensity. And that style completely divides audiences. For some viewers, the chaotic editing creates adrenaline. The movie feels frantic, dangerous, unpredictable. It mirrors the overwhelming experience of being trapped inside a monster attack where survival itself feels disorienting. But for others, it's exhausting. There are scenes where the camera shakes so aggressively and cuts so quickly that the choreography underneath almost disappears entirely. Instead of feeling immersed in combat, you feel trapped inside an editing machine, desperately trying to manufacture excitement through speed alone. And honestly, that's frustrating because there are clearly well-designed action concepts hidden underneath all that visual noise, especially during the hand-to-hand sequences involving Tony Jaa. You can tell there's real physical choreography happening, but the movie rarely trusts its performers enough to simply let the audience watch the movement. Everything gets fragmented, everything gets accelerated, everything gets overstylized. Even the camera movement itself becomes excessive at times. Anderson loves sweeping motion. Drone shots flying over battlefields, cameras circling characters dramatically, sudden angle shifts during fights. Constant movement during scenes that probably didn't need movement at all. At certain points, the filmmaking starts drawing attention to itself instead of the story. You stop focusing on the characters or monsters and start noticing the editing choices themselves. That's never a good sign, but weirdly enough, despite all those issues, the technical ambition still carries a certain charm. Monster Hunter may not always execute its visuals cleanly, but it commits to scale with complete confidence. Nothing about the film feels small, cheap, or visually timid. Even when sequences collapse into pure chaos, you can still feel the production trying to create a giant cinematic event. And honestly, that ambition is probably why some audiences still enjoyed the experience despite the flaws, because technically, Monster Hunter is never boring to look at. Messy, absolutely. Over-edited, constantly. Exhausting, at times, yes. But visually dull, never. The film is basically a collision between impressive production design and hyperactive filmmaking, a movie where the visuals often look huge, but the editing rarely gives them enough breathing room to truly land with the impact they deserve. For all the giant monsters, explosive action, and visual spectacle packed into Monster Hunter, the movie's biggest weakness eventually becomes impossible to ignore. The story barely exists. And honestly, that's the core problem holding the entire film back. Because underneath all the noise, Monster Hunter feels less like a fully developed screenplay and more like a collection of action sequences loosely connected together. The movie constantly moves forward, but rarely feels like it's actually progressing narratively. Things happen, characters run, monsters attack, another fight starts, but emotionally and dramatically, the story often feels stuck in place. And the frustrating part is that the movie actually begins with a strong concept. Modern soldiers trapped inside a deadly fantasy world filled with gigantic monsters. That's a fantastic setup for tension, survival, discovery, and character evolution. There's potential for fear, culture shock, adaptation, and mythology, but the screenplay almost immediately abandons depth in favor of non-stop spectacle. The moment Artemis and her team enter this alternate dimension, the film shifts into survival mode and never really slows down again. Instead of building the world carefully or developing the characters emotionally, the movie rushes from one creature encounter to the next, and eventually the repetition starts becoming obvious. Monster appears, characters panic, fight sequence. Escape, repeat. That structure becomes the entire narrative engine of the film. The problem is that action alone can't replace storytelling forever. Eventually, audiences start asking basic questions. Who are these people beyond their job titles? What do they fear? What do they want besides survival? How has this world changed them emotionally? The movie rarely answers any of it. Most of the supporting soldiers barely exist as characters before they're killed off. They're introduced quickly, given almost no meaningful personality, and then removed from the story before audiences can form any emotional connection to them. Which means their deaths don't really carry weight. They function more like disposable bodies designed to demonstrate how dangerous the monsters are. Even Artemis herself feels surprisingly underwritten. Milla Jovovich absolutely commits physically to the role, but the screenplay gives her very little emotional material to work with. For large portions of the movie, her character exists almost entirely in reaction mode, surviving attacks, fighting monsters, and moving from location to location. We rarely get insight into who she actually is beneath the action hero exterior, and then there's the dialogue. Honestly, some of the writing feels painfully thin. Certain attempts at humor land awkwardly. Emotional moments pass by too quickly to resonate. Conversations often exist purely to move characters toward the next action sequence instead of revealing anything meaningful about them. At times, the movie almost feels afraid of slowing down long enough for genuine character scenes. And that creates another major issue. The world building never receives enough narrative attention either. The screenplay introduces portals, alternate dimensions, ancient towers, hunter cultures, giant ecosystems, mysterious storms, and centuries of implied mythology, but barely explores any of it in depth. Important ideas get treated like background decoration. The movie keeps hinting at a larger story without ever fully committing to telling it. That's why Monster Hunter often feels incomplete instead of mysterious. There's a difference between intentionally leaving audiences curious and simply underdeveloping the narrative. And unfortunately, the film frequently falls into the second category. The pacing also becomes wildly uneven. The first half spends a huge amount of time isolated in the desert with Artemis and the hunter surviving monster attacks. Then suddenly, the movie shifts tone entirely once new characters and locations appear later on. It almost feels like two different films stitched together, one survival thriller, one fantasy action adventure. That tonal inconsistency makes the story feel unfocused. And then comes the ending, or more accurately, the non-ending. Because Monster Hunter doesn't really conclude its story so much as it abruptly stops and points toward a sequel. The climax feels less like a satisfying resolution and more like setup for future installments that may never happen. That frustrated a lot of viewers, especially because the movie finally starts expanding the world right before the credits roll, just when it feels like the story might actually deepen its mythology, introduce larger stakes, or fully embrace the fantasy universe it ends. And honestly, that's probably the best summary of the screenplay as a whole. Monster Hunter constantly feels like it's about to become a more interesting movie than the one we're actually watching. You can see the potential everywhere. The premise is strong, the world has possibilities, the creatures are visually memorable, the survival setup works, the hunter culture feels intriguing, but the writing never fully develops any of it beyond surface-level blockbuster entertainment. Instead of building emotional investment, the screenplay relies almost entirely on momentum and spectacle to keep audiences engaged. For some viewers, that's enough. For others, it makes the entire experience feel hollow, no matter how impressive the visuals become. Because giant monsters can create excitement, but without strong storytelling underneath them, even the biggest spectacle eventually starts to feel empty. At this point, Milla Jovovich and director Paul W.S. Anderson have built such a long-running creative partnership that the second she appears on screen in Monster Hunter, you already know exactly what kind of energy she's bringing to the film. Confident, physically aggressive, emotionally controlled, the unstoppable action lead standing in the center of total chaos. And honestly, whether that works for you or not depends heavily on how much you enjoy the action persona she's been refining for years, especially throughout the Resident Evil franchise. Because Monster Hunter essentially doubles down on that identity. Her character, Captain Natalie Artemis, is introduced as a highly trained military leader, and from the beginning, the movie treats her almost like a survival machine. She's tough, disciplined, resourceful, and capable of enduring absurd levels of punishment without breaking. The film rarely presents her as vulnerable for long before immediately pushing her back into combat mode. And physically, Jovovich absolutely commits to that role. No matter what people think about the screenplay itself, she throws herself fully into the action. Running through storms, climbing wreckage, fighting monsters, crawling through caves, surviving giant creature attacks, she carries the movie's physical demands almost nonstop from beginning to end. That's something even many critics of the film admitted. She understands this type of role extremely well. There's a reason she became such a recognizable figure in action fantasy cinema. She has the screen presence necessary to anchor chaotic blockbuster worlds where everything around her is exploding every few minutes. Even when the narrative loses focus, the audience still understands who the central figure is because Jovovich commands attention naturally. And honestly, Monster Hunter probably collapses completely without that level of commitment. But at the same time, the performance also exposes one of the film's biggest limitations. Because while Jovovich delivers physically, the screenplay gives her surprisingly little emotional depth to work with. Artemis spends most of the movie reacting instead of evolving. Survive the storm, fight the monster, escape the cave. Fight another monster, move to the next location. The character rarely gets quieter moments where personality, fear, trauma, or emotional complexity can fully emerge. Instead, the movie mostly treats her as an action icon, somebody meant to look cool, surviving impossible situations, rather than somebody experiencing genuine transformation. And that becomes increasingly noticeable as the film progresses. There are flashes where you can see more potential beneath the surface. Especially later in the movie, once the rigid military structure begins fading away, Jovovich starts loosening the performance slightly. The interactions with the hunter become more playful, more human, more expressive. Ironically, that's where the character becomes most likable, because the less the film forces her into stoic military dialogue, the more natural her screen presence starts feeling. Several viewers even pointed out that Jovovich seems far more entertaining once the movie allows her to embrace the absurdity of the world around her, instead of constantly trying to act intensely serious inside it. And honestly, that observation says a lot about Paul W.S. Anderson's filmmaking style in general. His movies often treat Jovovich less like a traditional dramatic character and more like a cinematic force moving through spectacle. The camera constantly frames her as larger than life, standing against storms, fighting gigantic creatures, surviving impossible situations, walking through destruction like a mythic action hero. For fans of that style, Monster Hunter delivers exactly what they wanted. This is classic Milla Jovovich action fantasy energy. But for audiences hoping for deeper characterization, the performance can feel trapped inside the screenplay's limitations. You keep sensing there could have been a more emotionally layered version of Artemis hidden somewhere inside the movie, but the film never pauses long enough to fully explore it. And then there's the controversial dynamic between Artemis and the hunter. Some viewers enjoyed the contrast between the hardened military soldier and the silent fantasy hunter, slowly learning to trust each other. Others felt the film leaned too heavily into making Artemis dominant in nearly every situation, sometimes at the expense of Tony Jaa's character and physical credibility. That divide became part of the conversation around her performance too, because Monster Hunter constantly positions Artemis at the absolute center of every major moment. The movie is clearly built around Jovovich as its primary star attraction, and sometimes that focus works, while other times it makes the supporting cast feel secondary to the Milla Jovovich action showcase. Still, regardless of the criticism, there's one thing the movie never lacks: commitment from its lead actress. Even when the dialogue becomes weak, even when the story loses coherence, even when the editing starts collapsing into chaos, Jovovich continues attacking the role with complete confidence. She believes in the movie's world, even when the screenplay struggles to support it. And honestly, that commitment probably explains why reactions to her performance are so mixed but rarely indifferent. Because whether audiences loved Monster Hunter or hated it, they almost always walked away remembering one thing: Milla Jovovich fighting gigantic monsters in the middle of a fantasy apocalypse. If there's one character who unexpectedly becomes the emotional center of Monster Hunter, it's the hunter. Played by Tony Jaa, the hunter enters the movie almost like a mythic figure emerging from the desert itself. While Artemis and her military squad arrive armed with guns, vehicles, and modern tactics, the hunter feels completely shaped by this brutal world. Every movement, every weapon, every survival instinct tells you immediately: this man belongs here. And honestly, the second Tony Jaa appears on screen, the movie's energy changes. Because unlike many of the other characters, the hunter doesn't rely on exposition or dialogue to become interesting. In fact, for most of the film, he barely speaks at all. His personality comes entirely through physicality, movement, reaction, combat rhythm, body language. That's where Tony Jaa's presence becomes incredibly valuable. Even viewers unfamiliar with his martial arts background could instantly feel the difference. He moves like somebody who understands action physically, not just cinematically. Every dodge, leap, climb, and attack feels controlled and deliberate, especially compared to the more chaotic military-style combat surrounding him. The hunter survives through adaptation. And that survival instinct becomes one of the movie's strongest ideas. While Artemis initially approaches this world like a soldier fighting an enemy, the hunter understands something much deeper. The monsters aren't just enemies, they're part of the ecosystem. Survival depends on understanding them, respecting them, and learning how to move within their environment. That contrast creates the core dynamic of the film. Modern warfare versus primal survival, technology versus instinct, gunfire versus handcrafted weapons. And naturally, because this is a blockbuster action movie, the first thing these two characters do when they meet is fight each other. Of course, the movie leans heavily into the classic future allies forced into conflict formula. Artemis and the hunter can't communicate properly because of the language barrier, so tension immediately escalates into a prolonged physical confrontation. And honestly, that sequence completely divides audiences. Some viewers enjoyed the absurdity of it, watching two highly skilled survivors trying to outmaneuver each other in the middle of this monster-filled wasteland creates a strange kind of survival buddy setup. The conflict eventually becomes part of how they learn to trust one another. But for others, the scene drags on far too long, especially because the movie sometimes turns their dynamic into exaggerated slapstick survival comedy rather than meaningful character development. Still, once the film stops forcing conflict between them and allows them to function as a team, the chemistry improves dramatically. That's when Monster Hunter becomes most entertaining. The hunter teaches Artemis how this world works, how to fight the creatures, how to navigate the terrain, how to survive without depending entirely on military technology. Their partnership slowly evolves from hostility into mutual respect, and those quieter interactions actually bring some much-needed humanity into the film. Ironically, the less they speak, the better their chemistry often becomes, because the movie accidentally stumbles into something genuinely effective: communication through action instead of dialogue. You understand their growing trust through cooperation during combat, shared survival experiences, and physical teamwork rather than long emotional conversations. And honestly, Tony Jaa carries a huge amount of that dynamic through sheer charisma. There's an effortless likability to the hunter. He feels comfortable inside the fantasy world in a way many other elements of the film don't. While Artemis often reacts to the chaos around her, the hunter moves through it naturally, almost like a guide introducing both the protagonist and the audience to this dangerous universe. That's why many viewers ended up wanting more of him. In fact, one of the most common reactions to the movie was frustration that Tony Jaa's abilities weren't utilized fully enough. This is a performer known for incredible martial arts precision and physical storytelling, but the film's hyperactive editing frequently interrupts his choreography before sequences can fully breathe. You can see glimpses of what could have been amazing, but the movie rarely slows down long enough to let him truly dominate an action scene the way audiences know he can. And then there's the larger criticism some viewers had regarding how the film balances power between the two leads. Because despite the hunter clearly being an experienced survivor from this world, the movie constantly positions Artemis as the dominant heroic figure. Sometimes that works because she is the protagonist. Other times, it makes the hunter feel oddly undercut despite Tony Jaa arguably bringing the more naturally engaging screen presence. Still, even with all those issues, the hunter remains one of the film's strongest elements. Not because the screenplay gives him deep emotional monologues or complex backstory, but because Tony Jaa understands how to make a character feel alive through movement alone. And honestly, that says a lot about why the Artemis-Hunter partnership works better than many other aspects of the movie. It's one of the few places where Monster Hunter briefly stops feeling like pure CGI spectacle and starts feeling like an actual adventure between two survivors learning how to navigate a deadly world together. One of the biggest problems with Monster Hunter is that for a movie filled with soldiers, hunters, commanders, and supporting characters, almost nobody besides Artemis and the hunter actually matters. And that becomes painfully obvious the longer the film goes on. The movie begins by introducing an entire military squad led by Milla Jovovich. On paper, this setup should create tension, chemistry, and emotional stakes. You've got trained soldiers entering unknown territory together, which naturally creates opportunities for conflict, loyalty, sacrifice, fear, and survival dynamics. But Monster Hunter barely develops any of them before chaos starts killing everyone off. Most of the squad members are defined by almost nothing beyond quick personality traits or recognizable faces. They exist more like placeholders inside the action than actual characters audiences are meant to emotionally invest in. And that's a huge issue for a survival story, because survival only becomes intense when you care who survives. Instead, many of the deaths happen so quickly and with so little buildup that they feel less tragic and more functional, almost like the screenplay checking names off a list in order to isolate Artemis for the real story. The soldiers mostly serve one purpose: demonstrate how dangerous the monsters are. That's it. Once the creatures start attacking, the supporting cast gets wiped out at such a rapid pace that the movie almost stops pretending they were important in the first place. Entire characters disappear before audiences have enough information to even remember their names. And honestly, that weakens the emotional core of the film immediately. Because imagine a version of Monster Hunter where the squad actually felt believable as a team. Imagine if the movie spent real time building relationships, tensions, rivalries, or camaraderie before throwing them into this nightmare world. Every monster attack would suddenly carry more weight because the audience would actually feel the loss. But the movie never slows down enough to do that. It prioritizes momentum over attachment. And unfortunately, the fantasy world characters don't fare much better either. Once Artemis enters the hunter world, the film begins teasing a larger cast of hunters, leaders, and civilizations that could have expanded the mythology in exciting ways. But again, most of these characters receive minimal screen time before the movie rushes toward another action sequence. The clearest example of this is probably Ron Perlman as the Admiral, now visually. He absolutely looks like he belongs inside this bizarre fantasy universe. Long hair, oversized costume design, giant weapons, pirate-like energy. He fits the exaggerated tone perfectly. But the problem is, he barely gets anything meaningful to do. The movie introduces him like he's supposed to be this major figure within the hunter world, somebody with authority, history, and deeper knowledge about the monsters and portals. You expect his arrival to massively expand the mythology or shift the story into a bigger fantasy adventure. Instead, he mostly delivers exposition, appears briefly, and then the movie races toward its climax. It feels like the film is constantly setting up characters for future importance without giving them enough present importance first. And that issue extends across almost the entire ensemble. The hunters don't get enough development. The military squad doesn't get enough development. The world leaders don't get enough development. Even characters who survive rarely feel fully explored. Monster Hunter treats supporting characters more like accessories to spectacle than actual participants in the narrative. And honestly, that creates one of the movie's biggest emotional weaknesses. The world feels populated, but not alive, because memorable supporting characters usually make fantasy worlds feel real. They create texture, personality, humor, tension, and emotional grounding around the central heroes. Think about the best adventure or fantasy films. Often the side characters become just as memorable as the protagonists themselves. Monster Hunter never quite reaches that level. Most people who watch the film primarily remember three things: the monsters, Milla Jovovich, Tony Jaa. Everybody else fades into the background almost immediately. And to be fair, some of that may come from the movie's pacing. The film moves so aggressively from one action sequence to another that there's very little room for supporting characters to breathe naturally. Conversations are short. Interactions are limited. Emotional beats get interrupted by explosions or monster attacks before they can fully develop. The screenplay simply isn't interested in slowing down for character depth, which is frustrating because you can occasionally see hints of a larger ensemble adventure hidden inside the movie. A stronger version of Monster Hunter could have built an entire hunter community with memorable personalities, rivalries, traditions, and emotional stakes tied directly to survival inside this dangerous world. Instead, most side characters exist only long enough to support the next action beat. And honestly, that's why the film sometimes feels emotionally empty despite all the chaos happening on screen. Because giant monsters alone can create spectacle, but memorable supporting characters are what make fantasy adventures feel truly alive. One of the hardest things to explain about Monster Hunter is its tone. Because the movie never fully commits to being serious, but it also never becomes a complete parody of itself either. Instead, it exists in this strange middle ground between blockbuster fantasy spectacle, survival action movie, creature horror film, and unapologetic B-movie chaos. And honestly, whether you enjoy the film or absolutely hate, it mostly depends on whether that tone works for you. Because Monster Hunter is the kind of movie that basically asks audiences one question: can you just go with it? If your answer is yes, there's a decent chance you'll have fun. If your answer is no, this movie becomes exhausting very quickly. From the beginning, the film throws realism completely out the window. Giant monsters erupt from underground. Electric sandstorms open dimensional portals. Soldiers survive situations that should absolutely kill them. Massive swords slice through creatures the size of buildings. Nothing about Monster Hunter wants to feel grounded. And to be fair, the movie knows that. That's actually one of the reasons some viewers ended up enjoying it despite all its flaws. The film fully embraces exaggerated fantasy action instead of trying to turn itself into serious prestige cinema. It understands that giant monster movies survive on energy, spectacle, and commitment to absurdity. This is pure popcorn entertainment, the kind of movie where you're supposed to sit back, stop questioning logic, and let the chaos wash over you for 90 minutes. And honestly, when the film leans fully into that identity, it can become weirdly entertaining, especially once Artemis and the hunter start functioning as a survival duo. The movie becomes less concerned with realistic military tension and more interested in giant creature encounters, oversized weapons, strange survival humor, and ridiculous action escalation. At times it almost feels like an old-school creature feature mixed with live-action anime energy. There's a very specific kind of B-movie charm buried inside all the chaos. The problem is that the tone becomes wildly inconsistent. Because Monster Hunter constantly shifts between trying to be intense survival horror and goofy blockbuster fantasy within the same scenes. One moment characters are getting brutally killed by horrifying monsters. The next moment the movie suddenly throws in awkward comedy, exaggerated reactions, or strange buddy comedy interactions. Sometimes the humor works because it embraces the absurdity naturally. Other times it completely disrupts whatever tension the scene was building. And that divide became one of the movie's biggest talking points. Some viewers genuinely enjoyed the silliness. They appreciated that the film didn't take itself too seriously. The exaggerated action, bizarre world, over-the-top visuals, and ridiculous monster battles created exactly the kind of escapist entertainment they wanted. For those audiences, Monster Hunter succeeds because it understands it's supposed to be fun first, not deep, not emotional, not intellectually complex, just loud fantasy spectacle. But for other viewers, the humor felt awkward and forced. Certain jokes land strangely. Some interactions drag too long. A few comedic moments feel almost imported from entirely different movies. And because the screenplay already struggles with emotional depth, the inconsistent humor sometimes makes it even harder to take the story seriously when the film suddenly wants dramatic tension again. That tonal imbalance becomes especially noticeable during scenes involving Artemis and the Hunter. At times, their chemistry works because the movie allows them to embrace the absurdity of surviving together in this insane world. Their communication through physical reactions instead of constant dialogue actually creates some genuinely entertaining moments. But then the film occasionally pushes the comedy too hard, turning potentially meaningful survival scenes into exaggerated slapstick or awkward, culture clash humor that doesn't always land. And honestly, this tonal confusion reflects Paul W. S. Anderson's filmmaking style in general. His movies often prioritize momentum and spectacle over tonal consistency. He wants action, horror, fantasy, humor, explosions, and visual coolness happening constantly, even if those elements sometimes clash against each other. Monster Hunter feels like a movie trying to deliver every kind of blockbuster entertainment simultaneously. Creature horror, military action, fantasy adventure, buddy comedy, video game spectacle, apocalypse survival, and somehow, despite how messy that combination becomes, there are still moments where the entertainment value genuinely works. Because the movie commits hard to its chaos, it never becomes small, restrained, or self-conscious. Every monster attack is huge, every action scene is oversized, every visual moment tries to feel cinematic and aggressive. Even when the film becomes ridiculous, it believes in its own spectacle completely. That confidence matters more than people think, because audiences can usually sense when a movie feels embarrassed by itself. Monster Hunter never feels embarrassed. Messy, absolutely, over the top, constantly, ridiculous, without question, but never embarrassed, and that's probably why reactions to the film are so divided. People who wanted thoughtful storytelling, emotional depth, or carefully balanced tone often found the movie hollow and chaotic, but audiences willing to accept it as pure B-movie monster mayhem often had a surprisingly good time with it. Because at the end of the day, Monster Hunter isn't trying to become a sophisticated fantasy epic. It's trying to become the cinematic equivalent of grabbing a controller, fighting giant monsters for 2 hours, and leaving the theater with adrenaline instead of emotional devastation. And depending on your expectations, that approach is either the movie's greatest strength or the exact reason it never rises above disposable spectacle. Watching Monster Hunter feels less like experiencing one completely original movie and more like watching fragments of multiple franchises collide together inside one giant fantasy action blender. Because throughout the entire film, you can constantly feel the DNA of other movies, games, and sci-fi worlds influencing almost every major scene. And honestly, that became one of the most divisive parts of the experience. For some viewers, those influences made the movie feel familiar, nostalgic, and entertaining in a chaotic B-movie way. For others, it made Monster Hunter feel like it never developed a true identity of its own. The most obvious comparison, of course, is Resident Evil, and honestly, Monster Hunter almost feels spiritually connected to that franchise in every possible way. Same director, same lead actress. Same obsession with slow motion, CGI creatures, survival action pacing, and hyper-stylized combat. At times, it genuinely feels like Paul W. S. Anderson simply traded zombies for giant monsters and kept the exact same filmmaking philosophy intact. You've got Milla Jovovich once again playing an unstoppable action, lead surviving impossible situations, while moving through collapsing environments filled with creatures trying to kill her every few minutes. That Resident Evil energy is impossible to miss, but the influences go way beyond that. The giant underground desert creature immediately reminded many viewers of Tremors. The way the monster moves beneath the sand like a predator tracking movement creates almost the exact same survival tension, humans stranded in open terrain while something massive hunts them from below. Then you've got the obvious Dune comparisons, the endless desert landscapes, the giant creatures moving beneath sand, the harsh survival atmosphere, the ancient structures buried in remote wastelands. Even visually, certain sequences feel heavily inspired by classic desert fantasy imagery audiences already associate with Dune-style science fiction. And honestly, the movie doesn't really hide those similarities. At other moments, the fantasy creature chaos starts resembling Godzilla or Jurassic World, giant beasts treated less like individual enemies and more like uncontrollable natural disasters, destroying everything around them. The scale becomes the spectacle. Then suddenly the tone shifts again, and the film starts channeling the energy of Pitch Black or the Chronicles of Riddick, isolated survivors trapped in a hostile alien environment, harsh landscapes, dangerous creatures emerging from darkness, small groups desperately trying to stay alive inside an unfamiliar world. Even the cave sequences with the spider creatures lean heavily into creature horror territory that feels inspired by multiple older monster films at once. And then there's the fantasy adventure influence. The oversized weapons, giant ships crossing desert landscapes, dramatic monster battles, and larger-than-life characters occasionally make the movie feel weirdly close to something like Pirates of the Caribbean. The Curse of the Black Pearl mixed with anime-style fantasy logic. Nothing in Monster Hunter operates on realism. Everything operates on rule of cool. If something looks visually awesome, the movie commits to it completely. That includes the action itself. Some viewers even compared the hyperactive editing and explosive visual style to Michael Bay at his most chaotic, especially during battle scenes where explosions, spinning cameras, CGI destruction, and rapid editing all collide simultaneously. And honestly, there are moments where Monster Hunter feels like it's pulling inspiration from literally everything: military sci-fi, fantasy adventure, creature horror, post-apocalyptic survival, video game boss battles, anime-style combat, B-movie monster cinema. The movie becomes this giant collage of familiar blockbuster ideas stitched together through non-stop action. And weirdly enough, that's either exactly why the film works for some people or exactly why it completely fails for others. Because if you enjoy watching recognizable influences collide into one loud spectacle, Monster Hunter can become strangely entertaining. There's a kind of shameless enthusiasm to how aggressively it borrows familiar genre energy and remixes it into giant creature warfare. The film almost plays like a cinematic tribute to decades of monster action storytelling, but at the same time, the constant comparisons also expose one uncomfortable truth. Almost every influence people mention feels more fully realized than Monster Hunter itself. That's the real problem. The movie constantly reminds audiences of stronger films, stronger worlds, stronger creature features, and stronger fantasy adventures. Instead of standing completely on its own identity, it often feels like it's chasing the energy of things audiences already love. And honestly, that may be why reactions to the movie feel so conflicted. Because Monster Hunter clearly understands the spectacle audiences want from giant fantasy action cinema: huge monsters, massive battles, survival chaos, overpowered weapons, epic landscapes. But somewhere between all those influences, the film struggles to become more than the sum of its inspirations. Still, even with all those comparisons, there's something undeniably fascinating about how committed the movie is to pure genre chaos. Monster Hunter may borrow from everything around it, but it does so with complete confidence, giant explosions, and absolutely zero interest in subtlety. One of the most interesting things about Monster Hunter isn't actually the movie itself, it's how completely divided audiences became after watching it. Because this is one of those films where two people can watch the exact same scenes and walk away with totally opposite reactions. One person sees loud, chaotic nonsense with terrible writing and exhausting editing. Another sees pure monster movie fun and exactly the kind of over-the-top fantasy spectacle they paid for. And honestly, both reactions make complete sense. The divide really comes down to expectations. If someone walked into Monster Hunter expecting a deep fantasy epic with rich world building, emotional storytelling, layered characters, and thoughtful writing, the movie was almost guaranteed to disappoint them. The screenplay is thin. The dialogue is weak. The pacing is messy. The editing often feels chaotic to the point of confusion. For those viewers, the movie became another example of a video game adaptation focusing entirely on spectacle while forgetting substance. And critics of Paul W.S. Anderson especially reacted harshly because many of the issues they already disliked about his filmmaking style are amplified here. The rapid cuts, the shaky camera movement, the obsession with style over depth, the non-stop action replacing genuine storytelling. To those audiences, Monster Hunter felt hollow, a giant CGI roller coaster with nothing emotionally meaningful underneath it. Some people outright called it one of the weaker video game movies they'd seen. But then there's the other side of the reaction: the viewers who walked into Monster Hunter fully understanding what kind of movie it was trying to be. And those audiences often had a surprisingly good time, because for fans of giant creature battles, exaggerated fantasy action, and unapologetic B-movie energy, the film absolutely delivers spectacle. The monsters are huge. The action rarely stops, the world looks visually ambitious, and the movie commits hard to its own ridiculousness. That commitment matters more than people think. A lot of viewers appreciated the fact that Monster Hunter never tried to become dark prestige cinema or emotionally self-important. It embraces giant weapons, explosive monster fights, fantasy nonsense, and chaotic survival energy with complete sincerity. For those audiences, the film works best when you stop analyzing it and simply enjoy the madness. That's why the phrase "turn your brain off fun" became attached to the movie so often. The film clearly expected sequels, more monsters, more worlds, more hunters, more escalating fantasy warfare. And weirdly enough, despite all the criticism surrounding the movie, some audiences genuinely wanted to see that continuation. Not necessarily because the first film was great, but because the world itself still felt full of untapped potential. That's the strange thing about Monster Hunter. Even people disappointed by the execution could still imagine a better sequel, a larger adventure, a stronger script, more developed lore, more hunter culture, bigger creature variety. The movie leaves behind the feeling that the best version of this franchise might exist somewhere in the future, rather than in the film we actually watched. But unfortunately, that also means the first movie ends up feeling incomplete on its own. Instead of delivering a fully satisfying journey with a clear emotional payoff, Monster Hunter closes like the opening chapter of a story we may never actually get to finish. And depending on the viewer, that cliffhanger approach either creates excitement for what could come next, or frustration that the movie spent more time building a franchise than completing its own narrative. At the end of the day, Monster Hunter is one of those movies that almost everybody agrees is flawed. The real argument is whether those flaws ruin the experience, or somehow become part of its chaotic charm. Because critically, the overall consensus surrounding the film settled into a very strange middle ground. Nobody really viewed it as a masterpiece. Very few people defended the writing. Almost everyone acknowledged the weak character development, the thin plot, the messy editing, and the overwhelming dependence on CGI spectacle. And yet, a surprising number of viewers still admitted they had fun watching it. That contradiction basically defines the entire movie. Monster Hunter is visually ambitious but narratively hollow. It's a film constantly caught between impressive production effort and shallow storytelling. You can see the money on screen. The monsters are massive, the environments are detailed, the sound design is huge, the action never stops. Every frame tries to feel cinematic and oversized, but emotionally. The movie rarely gives audiences enough substance underneath the spectacle, and that became the central criticism repeated over and over again. The story feels underdeveloped, the dialogue feels weak. The characters exist mostly to survive action scenes rather than experience meaningful arcs. The mythology is teased more than explored. The world building hints at something much deeper than the screenplay ever fully delivers. For many viewers, that made the entire experience feel empty despite all the visual chaos happening on screen. At the same time, though, Monster Hunter also earned a very specific type of appreciation. Not because it was sophisticated, but because it completely committed to being ridiculous blockbuster entertainment. The movie never apologizes for its giant monsters, oversized weapons, absurd survival logic, or explosive fantasy chaos. It embraces all of it with full confidence. And for audiences willing to meet the movie on those terms, there's genuine entertainment hidden underneath the flaws. That's why so many reactions ended with some version of, "It's dumb, but I still had fun." And honestly, that sentence probably summarizes Monster Hunter better than anything else, because this isn't a movie audiences admire for emotional storytelling or brilliant writing. It's a movie audiences survive. A loud, visually aggressive creature feature, where enjoyment depends almost entirely on how much chaos you're willing to embrace before the spectacle overwhelms you. The performances reflect that same divide too. Milla Jovovich received praise for fully committing physically to the role, even from people who disliked the screenplay itself. Tony Jaa was frequently highlighted as one of the movie's most likable elements, with many viewers wishing the film utilized his abilities more effectively. Meanwhile, director Paul W.S. Anderson remained the center of the biggest debate surrounding the film, because Monster Hunter feels like the ultimate example of his filmmaking identity. For fans of his style, the movie delivers exactly what they expected: fast pacing, huge action, stylized visuals, B-movie energy, video game spectacle. For critics of his style, the movie also delivers exactly what they feared: weak writing, chaotic editing, thin characterization, style overpowering substance. And honestly, both sides are right. That's what makes the film so interesting to discuss. Monster Hunter succeeds and fails for almost the exact same reasons. The non-stop spectacle creates energy, but also exhaustion. The exaggerated fantasy creates entertainment, but also emotional detachment. The visual ambition creates memorable imagery, but also exposes how underdeveloped the story really is. It's a movie constantly balancing on the edge between thrilling and ridiculous. Sometimes it falls on the right side, sometimes it crashes completely into the wrong one, but it never feels passive. Even people who hated Monster Hunter usually had strong reactions to it. And honestly, in today's blockbuster landscape, that alone makes it more memorable than many generic action films audiences forget the second the credits roll. Because Monster Hunter may not be a great movie, but it's absolutely a movie with identity. Messy identity, chaotic identity, overloaded identity, but identity nonetheless. And that's probably why the final consensus surrounding the film never became simple. It's not universally loved, it's not universally hated. It exists somewhere in that strange territory, reserved for ambitious, flawed spectacle films, movies that audiences recognize are deeply imperfect, yet still occasionally entertaining enough to leave behind giant monsters, explosive battles, and just enough unrealized potential to make people wonder what a better version could have looked like.